Hello there gents, now I'm sure that you're just as well aware that 3D printing is becoming ever more popular in the tabletop community. 3D printers have become almost a must-have in the use of creating assets for tabletop games. And far be it from me to start levying criticism or pointing out names, and of course not looking at anyone directly, though it is somewhat both amusing and ironic that some of the largest tabletop gaming companies are so vehemently against 3D printing. And of course, not naming any names. Which is where I put forward the idea, what if you had a game that was entirely centered around being 3D printed? All of its assets were ready for you to download and print off. Let me introduce you to Locus Fleet Commander. Should I be brief about it, then Locus was a series of stories that I wrote, or well, I guess I am still writing, which I began back when I was around in college, back when I was a young lad. Of course, the logical next step was this would make a good tabletop game, so that's what I did. And here we now have Locus Fleet Commander, a game which all the assets are downloaded and printed off. If you want to look deeper into this, then there are many videos on this channel that you can look at. Currently, at the time of me uploading this video, I already have a single video of me going over the basic core rules of Locus Fleet Commander, as well as several videos going over the lore and stories. And of course I do plan on uploading many more. While I do have a lot of videos discussing the story, I'll explain a little bit here. There are many time periods in the Locus timeline, but currently the story is about the slow degradation and a civil war of a galactic-wide regime called the Great Realm, where many of its dominions, chiefly the Principality of Carapath, are rising up against it. Now, much of Locus is designed with a lot of just generally my interests in mind, of which, of course, I have many. I do enjoy a lot of military stuff, specifically military engineering, and so a lot of the equipment, warships and other bits I've designed for Locus are designed to look like they could realistically function. Warships designed for Locus look like they can take a beating, and I discuss quite a lot of the military engineering in my video about the Imperial Navy. Political science, and more so the tyrannical regimes of the 20th century, was something I've been very interested in as well. So aside from the military engineering, I do also want the politics of this universe to realistically function as well. If you start to get deep into the lore, I think some may call Locus dystopian. I mean, if you just look at the two greatest human factions in Locus, the Great Realm and the Principality of Carapath, then they don't even really disagree on being tyrannical dictatorships, they just mainly disagree on who should be the tyrannical dictator. I mean, it is an interesting thought to me as the Great Realm is a military dictatorship with like a cruel aristocracy and a caste system. And you have freedom of speech as long as you're not speaking. And you can see why if you live like that for 10 millennia, then well, ideas of democracy or freedom just would not exist. Of course, the flip side is, how else do you even run an empire so big? Especially when humanity has to contend with very many horrific alien monsters that would easily see its eradication. Anything less than a military dictatorship may mean total extinction. You may call that dystopian, I call that a glimpse into the future. Though with that out of the way, I think there are some things we should note about the Locus story before we move on. First off, it doesn't take place in our galaxy, it takes place in a distant galaxy called Avraxis, which of course is just something I've made up. The reason for it is it allows me a lot more freedom in how I want to design things, how I want to make the history. If I want to be realistic about things, then I don't have to worry about where real star placements are. I can just make them up. But one thing I did learn while researching into designing the Locus setting was how many worlds are actually in a galaxy. The answer is we don't really know because it's pretty difficult to start counting all the stars in the sky, and not to mention that like as stars kind of cluster, they're like masks each other, but there are estimations. And for the Milky Way, the estimation is between 100 to 400 billion stars. That's ridiculous. Which is why in Locus, when we begin dealing with interstellar empires, the actual number number of territories they control will be ridiculous. And it's why I also give estimations to these but no exact number, because the Great Realm controls anywhere between like 50 to 80 billion worlds, and so when you control that many worlds it's going to be very easy to lose count. But it's also realistic that that's how many worlds it would control if it controlled about half the galaxy anyway, which, you know, in story it does. And so, as ridiculous as some of the numbers get in Locus, they are actually realistic to how they would be in real life. Now, of course, not all of those worlds are inhabited. In that numbers encompass a lot of like uninhabited worlds. They are still used for, like, an uninhabited world will still be used for like mining operations. Like you could get like mine gas in a gas giant, for example. And so in terms of actual inhabited worlds, it's only about 10% of that, which would still be 5 to 8 billion worlds in that make up the Great Realm in terms of inhabited worlds, and so that's still a ridiculous number. But of course you can go watch my actual lore videos to find out more about that. In terms of the game itself, I want it to be rather welcoming to new people. I went in with the mindset of not overcomplicating things, and things that do get relatively complicated, you don't have to play with them. They're usually in advanced rules that you can play without. Generally, for me, the most complicated thing when playing the game is flipping through the pages looking for statistics, which is probably why it's best to, let's say, write it down on a notepad or something when you're playing. And once again, I'm not pointing out any, I'm not pointing out any names. But for Locus Fleet Commander, you don't have to do any 5th dimensional mathematics to understand how to play the game, and wargamers will know what I'm talking about. Though one aspect of naval strategy games that I think is totally overlooked is the concept of customization. And I don't just mean in terms of like its colour scheme. Sure, you can paint your ships whatever you want, it's encouraged. But in terms of actually being able to customise the weaponry on your ship, I've noticed a lot of issues with many naval strategy games is that you can't actually choose what kind of weapons your ship has. Ships of the same class must always have the same weapons loadout, which is strange because that's not at all what real life was like. If you look at real life, ships of the same classes always had like different weapons loadouts or different modifications to them. And Locus has a very similar system, where you have the base of a warship, so you have a ship hull, and that'll be the class of ship. Let's say it's a scimitar class or a prince class. But then that hull has a certain weapon slot, and then that faction has weapons that can go into that slot. And currently there are 3 types of weapon slots: single, medium, large and prow. Though there are more kinds of weapon slots that I do plan for in the future. But generally speaking, the idea is you're able to customise your ships for a certain role. It allows you for more control over how you design your fleet. There are also different cosmetic designs and patterns that you can have for your ships. So let's say there'll be different kinds of prows for the same ship. While stuff like prows won't actually serve a function in game, that's just appearances, the choice of weaponry you make of course changes how ships perform. But it allows you really to make your fleet your own. It allows you to add a little bit of yourself into the story. And Locus is set so that, you know, people can perfectly make up their own stories within it. You can make your fleet with your story, and I think that's part of the enjoyment of these sorts of games, is the ability to put a piece of yourself into it. And so I've designed Locus Fleet Commander to focus a lot more on that. In fact, there is nothing in law saying that you cannot paint your ships a bright fluorescent pink. The one thing stopping you may just be the judgment of your peers. Of course, do as you wish with it. There are already several canonical colour schemes in Universe, though in Universe factions are all split up into sub-factions, so different war bands or fleets will all have their own colour schemes. So it really does lend into you being able to customise it for yourself. And of course, if all of this is interesting you, then you can find this on my Patreon. Now, many of the aspects of the game are actually free, like the rules book for example. If you want to take a look at the rules book, you can just download it, it's just a PDF file. Even many of the props and the neutral ships, they're all just free to download. Though the majority of the actual ships as playing pieces, you do still need to buy. And there are several ways to do so. The main platform I'm currently using is Patreon, though I do wish to expand to Ko-fi if I haven't already. already, and wherever else I'd be able to sell them. And either you can just buy individual model files or you can subscribe for a lot more. And I'm not stingy about it, so it is all relatively cheap. In fact, it's extraordinarily cheap compared to how much you'd be paying if, let's say, it was some other games companies that we're not going to name. I mean, some of the highest tiers on my Patreon are about the same price of a tank, if it's like a single tank in some of the tabletop games. And you don't just get one thing, you get the files to print them off infinitely. Of course, relative links are in the description. I can afford to keep it so cheap as I am just one guy. Like, not only do I want this to be accessible to as many people as I can make it accessible to, but being just one person also means that I can keep the costs low. And yes, for the most part, Locus has been a one-man project. I have had certain help from friends when writing particular aspects of the story, and I didn't do the art. I've paid people on Fiverr to do that, and I will flash up the names of everybody that I've worked with right here. But for most things like the rules, the stories, the game, the ship models, the graphic designs of the rulebook, like certain bits of art in the rulebook like these ship designs for example, I did myself. And so it is mostly just me doing it. And what I've released now isn't just the only things I want to release. There's actually quite a lot of stuff that I have planned. In the future, things that are on tiers for patrons may change. Like everything that's still there will stay there. It's just about adding more stuff. There are many new factions that I want to add, for example, or even new additions to the game. And I think this is where we can begin talking about how I want to expand going into the future. I've had many considerations about how I'm going to do this. Though going into the future, I think what I'll do in terms of expansions is I'll just introduce new rules books. It won't be like entirely rewriting the rules, rather it'll just be adding additions to the rules. Because there are many rules in Locus Fleet Commander that I feel weren't as expanded on that I do want to expand more on, like the idea of campaigns. But what I can do with these expansions is I can focus on, let's say, another aspect of the story where I can introduce the new factions through that way, or even sub-factions. Or even add ships to existing factions. This method of doing things should allow me to compact the expansions to Locus rather than just being like, hey guys, I threw out another ship. It's like, you know, you've got, okay, well this ship is coming out in this expansion, this faction's coming out in this expansion. There's my reason as to why you should stay subscribed to the Patreon. Also the fact that to be able to do most of this, I probably need as much time as I can get. I found that my issue with a lot of this isn't necessarily money, but it's time. And time is money, so ironically enough, it's an issue of money. And as much as I adore the fact and am blessed with the ability to work as a fucking cashier, the problem is, of course, that time gets in the way of me working on Locus stuff. And while, of course, nobody is obliged to give me money, if you find that you enjoy Locus, you think it's interesting, and you want to see more of it, then it would be very much appreciated if you at least put a small amount of cash my way, so that I would be able to create more Locus stuff, which can then be enjoyed by you lot. So at least give the Patreon a look. And if you want to test out some of the models that I've made to see some of the ships, then a lot of the free stuff will be on my Thingiverse account. The links to that will of course also be in the description. But in terms of that, I'm going to be constantly adding new things. It's not just going to be Locus Fleet Commander. Of course, there'll be a lot of expansions for Fleet Commander, but it's not just Fleet Commander that I have ideas for. There are other games that I've tested and prototyped. Sticking with Locus, then there are two other Commander games I've got in mind. The first is Wing Commander, which is where you play as the air squadrons. I know fighter wings aren't really all that in-depth in Locus Fleet Commander, and I would like to expand on them in an expansion later on, but I do think they also deserve their own game entirely. And in Locus Wing Commander, we can also have like gunboats and all that, like non-capital ships that were too small to put in Locus Fleet Commander. I also want, you know, ground battles, which I've aptly named Locus Squad Commander, which if you go onto my Thingiverse, there is a tank model you can download. It's a tank that I made a long time ago, but it is supposed to be a type of light tank that the Great Realm uses. And so that light tank may be a good example of what things in Locus Squad Commander will be like. And so there are other games also also set in the Locus universe I have planned, and those are just like the sort of military strategy games. I have some vague ideas for other kind of more RPG-like games that would also be set in Locus. But, of course, the sky's the limit and only the future will tell what will come out. But it's not just Locus games that I've got ideas for. There are several other settings and stories that I've written about that aren't just Locus. One of them is Black Citadel, which is a fantasy setting that I wrote. I won't get into the lore, but currently that's an empire building game. There is also like a fantasy naval strategy game that I designed for that as well. But all these sort of games are only like half cooked. The only one that's actually finished right now is Locus Fleet Commander. And I have also expanded into the realm of video games. I'm a big fan of RPG Maker games, and so I have also made an RPG Maker game called Lost Library. That one also isn't finished. But oh yeah, there is more to look forward to in the future. Now you might be wondering where I find the time to do all of this stuff, and the answer is I have absolutely no idea. Now if any of you want to ask about anything or discuss any of the projects that I'm working on, then I do in fact have a Discord server. The server's just named after the channel, and it is basically just a place for my projects, mainly for you to keep up to date with what's actually going on. It's just an easier way for me to relay news. So if you want to come along, say hi, ask me any questions, or just generally stay up to date, then that would be the place to do so. If you want any of the art that I'm using in my videos, you know, the art that I've commissioned for Locus or whatever, I will also be posting them up on that server. So Discord is the preferred method of getting in contact with me. But what of the actual channel itself, the channel that you're watching this on? So, fun fact, both this channel and the Discord are actually named after one of the castles in Black Citadel. That is a fun little factoid to mention. You can see it in the small snippet of the big map that I drew for Black Citadel. This aside, this channel is going to be used for me to discuss the projects that I'm working on. So it'll be mainly uploading things like lore videos discussing the story, character biographies, or videos discussing gameplay, or other videos related to the projects that I'm doing. Basically anything in a video format that I release related to my works will be released here on this channel, which hopefully sums up what this channel is going to be used for, just for me to talk about my projects. If all of this is interesting to you, then I'd encourage you to watch the other videos on my channel. I would recommend starting with the basics of Locus Fleet Commander. Of course, I wish you have a good rest of your day, and I hope to see you over at the basics of Locus Fleet Commander.